So let's deep dive into this. On one side, you've got the bonhomie between the Prime Minister and the Russian President. That's become the subject of much discussion because Ukrainian President Zelensky posted a very critical message on X saying he's disappointed with the leader of the world's largest democracy hugging Putin, who he described as a war criminal. So has India gone overboard in reaching out to Russia? Could the hug have been avoided? Was there another way to reach out without getting too friendly? What is the signal from the Modi-Putin meet? Did India go overboard in reaching out to the Russian president? Is the West, on the other hand, guilty of double standards? These are just some of the questions that I will raise tonight. Joining me now is Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary, joins me, and KC Singh, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, is also with it. Good to have both of you. Remember, Kanwal Sibal has served in Russia as well in the past. And I come to you, Mr. Sibal. How do you see the bonhomie between the Prime Minister and the Russian President at a time when a large part of the Western world sees Putin as a war criminal who should be ostracized?
Well, a couple of things. Modi and Putin have hugged each other on several occasions. And therefore, it is not surprising that they did so again, especially as Prime Minister is reviving the summit dialogue with Putin and has gone all the way to Russia as his first bilateral visit. Now, supposing he had not hugged Putin, a lot of meaning would have been read into it, that while he was hugging him before, there's now a coolness in the relationship. Now India is trying to send a message to Putin that we're not satisfied with what you are doing in Ukraine, or even in terms of our bilateral relations. So I think it's quite normal, and we shouldn't make too much of a fuss about it. Zelensky is totally out of line in saying what he did. I mean, he's trying to be rhetorical when he himself actually is no longer a fully legitimate leader. Because
no, but he's saying this with due regard, Mr. Sibal, isn't he saying it on a day when a hospital has been bombed in Kiev, innocents have been killed? It's not just Zelensky. There are large sections of global capital in the Western world who today see Putin as a leader who has to be ostracized as a war criminal.
Yes, but that is their perspective. And of course, we must then dive deep into what has been the cause for all the devastation that is taking place and the conflict. Why did it in the first place got triggered? And the West, to my mind, is far more responsible for the triggering of this conflict than Russia is when it took the action to launch this military intervention in Ukraine. Now, the fact is that you know that just a few days ago, there was a bombing of the beach in Crimea, where lots of civilians were killed and lots of civilians were injured. They were just people who were going for fun and games on the beach in Crimea, and Zelensky was responsible. So I don't take what Zelensky says seriously. Neither do I think that we should make our foreign policy on the basis of what Zelensky thinks or what the Americans think with regard to this specific issue. We have a national interest. We have very vital relations with Russia, and we are not there to please anybody with regard to our foreign policy. Yes, we must balance our foreign policy. And I am quite actually surprised that the Prime Minister, in his opening remarks to the press at his meeting with President Putin, actually indirectly referred to what had happened when he said that children, when they get killed, it causes us a great deal of pain, and that solutions must be found through peace and dialogue and not on the battlefield and this and that. In fact, this is a bow to the West in terms of making it clear that he has not come there to fully endorse what is happening on the ground without really overtly criticizing Russia. But I think the subtext of this is what it is. Okay. That he's also expressing his concern at what happened.
You're saying what India has done, I take your point. You're saying what India has done is in its national interest. India cannot be bullied by the West to take sides in this war. KC Singh, do you agree with that? Or do you believe the Prime Minister was a little excessive in his because he was getting Russia's highest award, he was out there completely seemingly in bonhomie with Putin, who all said and done remains a leader who a large part of the world looks at very suspiciously today, if not with outright hostility?
Well, not only the large part of the world, the International Criminal Court has declared him as a fugitive. And that's why when the BRICS meeting was held in South Africa, the South Africans came under pressure that if the Russian president attends, then you'll have to arrest him. I think they then asked Mr. Putin to stay away. So it's not just a question of some countries, but yes, we have to do the balancing. We can't give up our relations with Russia. But remember that Putin's first visit abroad after the Ukraine conflict was to China. And that is the Indian concern, that you don't want to push Russia completely into the Chinese corner. I think somehow the timing got a bit wrong with the Prime Minister's visit. His hugging is fine because that is his diplomacy, which is kind of his characteristic now. He hugs almost anyone who's not a female leader. So I don't think that is anything special reserved from Mr. Putin. But you've got the 75th anniversary NATO meeting taking place in Washington, 9th to 11th. Zelensky is going to be there. So you've got 32 NATO countries and 5 more from the Indo-Pacific, which is Japan, Republic of Korea, New Zealand, and so on and so forth. So the Americans have gathered them there as basically to have NATO play a role outside the Atlantic area.
But why should India be worried? KC Singh, there'll be those who will say, why should India be worried about what Washington or NATO have to say? We have to act in our own self-interest. Russia is our all-weather friend. They've stayed with us. We have a strong defense relationship with them. We've been getting cheap oil from the Russians as well. It's all in India's interest. And if Vladimir Putin invites us, why will we not go and reach out to him if he reaches out to us?
Absolutely correct. But the problem is that in the new bipolar world which is emerging, it is Russia and China which are leading one side. It's no longer just Soviet Union. And in this, it's the Chinese which are a problem for India. Now, if you want to take on the Chinese, the NATO are also, by inviting countries from the Pacific, they're also, in a sense, enlarging the role of NATO to look at the Indo-Pacific, which means China. And that is the problem that India has, that you want to engage Russia. You don't want them to just go completely in the Chinese corner. At the same time, you don't want to offend the West too much or the NATO countries, because we have other kinds of needs and engagement with them, specifically as far as China is concerned, and your economy is concerned, and technology is concerned. So this is part of the balancing. But I think part of the optics where sometimes it goes wrong, which diplomacy cannot cater to, because you don't know that Putin's going to bomb a children's hospital. But I think MEA should have known that you had the NATO summit. And that is the 75th anniversary.
So you're questioning the timing. Let's also be very clear that when the United States sort of targets us or Zelensky targets us, let's not forget that this is a country which has reached out to Netanyahu, even though Israel has been bombing young innocents in Gaza. So the Americans perhaps don't have any moral high ground to stand on. But you made an important point about both NATO and China. And I want to turn Kanwal Sibal for a moment to China. KC Singh is right. Russia's special relationship with China, the first country that Putin went after the Ukraine war was to China. They have this special relationship. Where does India fit in? Is it purely limited strategic benefits that we are getting from the Russians that drive us into the Russian arms so warmly?
Well, firstly, who has pushed Russia into the arms of China? Now, when the United States declares both Russia and China as its adversaries, and then openly declares that they want a strategic defeat of Russia, and they want to isolate Russia diplomatically, internationally, and they want a solution on the battlefield to force Putin to negotiate and apply absolutely unprecedented sanctions on Russia, hoping that this would lead to the collapse of Russia, economic collapse of Russia, and potentially, therefore, regime change in Russia. So who does Putin turn to? Not India. India has got excellent relations with the United States, and they'll keep growing. There's a lot happening between the two countries. But China is also the adversary of the United States, so Russia and China get together. And they can get together because geography helps them. They have a huge common border. They have contiguity. China is hungry for resources of Russia, especially oil and gas. And if Russian gas and oil are blocked by the West, then obviously China is the market. If consumer goods, export of consumer goods by the West is not allowed to go to Russia, are not allowed to go to Russia, China is biggest manufacturer of the world today. So they provide all that Russia may need. And that's why their trade has gone up to $240 billion. And 80% of it is in their national currencies. So this is the drive behind the Russia-China relationship. There's nothing that we can do about it.
Yes,
and when the United States built
then
up
do we
China,
expect
no,
Russia to stand by us?
Let me complete.
You know, when there is Chinese aggression on our border?
No, just let me complete my thought.
Yes.
When the United States was building up China for years, were they concerned about the China-India relationship? Because our problems with China are enduring. They are nothing new. But then we didn't object because we knew that there is a certain policy of the United States in which we can't play a role. But we were more interested in pursuing our interests in the United States without lecturing to the United States, please don't build up your relationship with China because we are vulnerable. And secondly, it's very important for us that Russia continues to give importance to our ties with India, because Russia also wants to balance its ties with China. It doesn't want to become over-dependent on China. Russia has got very sophisticated diplomacy, great experience in diplomacy, and they know that India is the only country in Asia which can help to balance China. And therefore, and for us, it is very important that China gets the message that Russia is interested in strong ties with Russia, and this can operate as some kind of a moderating force on China. So there are a lot of very vital geopolitical, bilateral, international interests involved in what we are doing with Russia. And we should not be unnecessarily bothered about what United States thinks or Zelensky thinks or anybody else thinks. And this hospital thing, there is a doubt about what actually caused this hospital strike, but I'll leave it at that.
You know, KC Singh, therefore, from Kamal Sibbal's perspective, certainly self-interest above all else. Our self-interest at the moment lies in a stronger relationship with Russia, not necessarily prejudicing either our relationship with Washington or much of the Western world. And just as the Western world has relationships with those perceived as autocratic leaders, so will India. Why should we be worried anymore about what the Western world has to say?
Because, Rajdeep, nothing is static. Things are evolving. Our relationship with the West is evolving. The closeness that we have with the US today, we didn't have 10 years ago. We certainly didn't have 20 years ago. When we tested our bombs in 1998, our relationship sank to the lowest level. And since then, we've been rebuilding it. Now, the question is, how does diplomacy handle this contradiction that you're able to balance between the two groups? I think that is only that is a limited point. Nobody disagrees. Mr. Sibbal is absolutely right. You have to look after your interests. How do you do it in a manner that you don't get embarrassed? Because Zelensky is going to be there in Washington. He'll be talking to all those countries, the 31 NATO members and 5 more which have gone from the Pacific. You don't want to be the subject matter of the NATO debate. But because of the timing, because of the visit taking place now and the optics of it, I think it's become a little more difficult for Indian diplomacy to sell it as a balancing. Because those opposed to India will say, look, you've been trusting India, but India is doing this. So it's the balancing that causes the problem. And remember that when the Ukraine meeting, a meeting on Ukraine took place in Geneva, we attended it, but we didn't go with the resolution. We didn't sign it. So we've been doing a balancing, but simply to keep saying that war is not the solution, dialogue and diplomacy are required. Today, the Secretary General of NATO put it well. He said, yes, you can have peace if the idea is to accept defeat at war. That is the worry today is not that. Worry today is Trump coming tomorrow. NATO's biggest concern is not Putin today. It's not India. It's not China. It's that tomorrow if Trump comes, what happens to NATO? And Trump is around the corner. And they also worried what Biden may be doing during the next 2 days. If he appears very shaky and performing like during his debate, what is a signal that the European NATO members get? So it's a very critical kind of meeting which is taking place in Washington, as much to assess Biden as to understand where America will be after the next November election. And therefore, there is concern all over. There is major global churn and concern. We've seen the elections in France. We've seen the rise of the right wing. We've seen how it's been stopped there. So there is a major churn taking place. And Putin is exploiting it. And that is why the current president of the European Union, the president of Hungary, He's gone across to Russia. And it's not been liked by the European Union members, but he is the president. They said, you're not authorized to discuss Ukraine war, but he's gone there and made his own statement. So this is part of Ukraine's outreach to create divisions amongst whatever he sees as people on the other side or people on the fence. And Americans will try the reverse. Our diplomacy has to handle it. And this is part of the handling of that.
Let's leave it there, K.C. Singh. It's fascinating the way you put it, because this is a new world out there. A new world with multipolar interests in different parts of the world, balancing those interests, not easy. And as you said, perhaps the timing will be questioned given that NATO meet starts tomorrow. But either way, India believes that it's working in its own national interest above all else. Thank you very much for joining me. Those images, of course, will remain dominant in several global capitals, that bonhomie between the Prime Minister and the Russian President.